to Alba.
Fantastic. Thank you once again, UCLA, UCI, Southern California, NIOSH Education and Research Center. You do so much for the safety and health of the workers. And thank you, all of you, for registering it and passing the word about this update webinars. I also know your website has a ton of different upcoming webinars on the same topic. So stay tuned. That's my information right there on the screen. Most of you already know me. So if you need to look me up, my website or the actual federal OSHA website also has a list of authorized outreach trainers. My name is there. Just make sure to type it VAZQUEZ. The learning objectives for today have to do with interpreting or reviewing, because 1 hour is really truly very little time to go ahead and just dissect regulations. So we focus on that update to wildfire smoke protection standard, including the new provisions for domestic workers engaged in cleanup activities, differentiating between the various types of respiratory protection, particulate respirators, starting with the N95, the basic dust masks, as we call them, and the P100 respirators, to be able to identify the appropriate protection level for specific wildfire cleanup related tasks. So we're going to talk about cleanup more than anything right now, because last month I talked about the actual air quality and sending workers in areas affected by smoke, wildfire smoke. And so that's the emergency regulation. But now we are focused today on, we have workers who will be out there cleaning up and who will be asked to actually deal with ash, debris, soot, cleaning up surfaces, etc., because of the fires. And so I want to give you some of the tips and step-by-step solutions so that you stay safe, because this is what these webinars are all about. Let's give the workers tools so that their health is not affected. Health and safety, right? So when we say health and safety, we're looking at two aspects of it, right? The physical health, prevention from fires, explosions, chemical exposure, spills, etc. But the health aspect of it is that your lungs and your internal organs and the kidneys and all those organs that are processing constantly all those toxins stay well, that you don't overwhelm them because you are exposing them to above the exposure limit that is legally allowed in this work environments. So understanding the distinctions between what is it when you're required or mandated to have a respirator put on your face to actually do the work versus voluntary basis. So there's a lot of questions about this topic that we will tackle today. It'll be clear as water for you once we finish today. And the identification of the exposure thresholds that trigger different levels of respiratory protection. So I'll give you some tools and I'll give you some examples. We will not go in depth on this just because of the amount of time we have, but at least you will have some guidance as to how to select respirators according to the hazards you are being exposed to. All right, let's get started. Make sure you sign up to the California OSHA news releases, because they're very helpful. In this case, February 5th, 2 days ago, we had this Department of Industrial Relations issuing critical guidance for worker safety during wildfire cleanup and recovery. And it's a two-part letter where what we have mainly is assistance in case of you working in an evacuation zone and you don't know that you have the right to refuse work there. Also protections for workers such as wage theft, etc. So there's great information in this news release, and it also guides you through a link to actually understand a little bit of the requirements for employers whenever you're going to be doing cleanup. And I like to think about cleanup in two parts. One is the heavy duty, I need to be in a hazmat suit to do phase one, meaning there's damaged structures and we're going to find a lot of hazardous materials on site. And this is what the U.S. Army Corps Engineer is actually tasked with doing during phase one. And then you have to have the EPA actually render your property safe in order for you to get permission to move to phase two, which is the actual clearing up of debris. But this is for those homeowners, residences, schools, libraries, structures, buildings that got damaged and destroyed by the fire. And then you have the issues of workers that are exposed to the ash, the soot, the dust, the actual toxic materials, because they are called to aid in the cleanup of structures that did not get burnt down. So you have a lot of that surface residue, and this is where you must understand, what am I exposing myself to, and am I bringing this home to my family, my kids, my pets, etc., and just spreading it in my work environment. So very good news release to read. I kind of just summarized it right now. There's another one. Oh, actually, this news release triggers or sends a link to the actual wildfire cleanup training tool. So I want to pause here and kind of dissect it, just because one of the questions, or a couple of times repeated in the submission of questions for this webinar, was in regards to where can we find resources for immigrant workers. This particular news release has a link for the English and Spanish version of this one-page, very helpful tool. And I say very helpful because let's go ahead and look at what it contains. Number one, big letters, protect your health. How do you do that, right? And so as we are facing this, let's clean up and recover in these areas of fire, the goal is to protect the health of the workers. So there's these workers who are authorized to do this cleanup during phase one. We're not going to focus on that today because those guys need to have higher training, hazardous materials, cleanup training, etc. So that's why the first thing here is check with your hazmat crew. And that also translates to any other worker called to do cleanup of surfaces with ash, soot, anything that relates to cleaning up structures and buildings around those burned down areas. And sometimes it's not just adjacent to the burned down areas or fire damaged areas, but also miles around and all the perimeter around the fires. So the first thing is to check if those properties have been cleared by what? Your hazmat crew and then the EPA, right? So we said there's phase one, there's phase two, and homeowners cannot return, or the owners of these properties cannot return to these areas unless they have been through phase one and then phase two. But phase two, they can't even get to debris recovery unless the EPA has cleared that area because they're concerned about all these hazardous materials on site. So remember, you're dealing with a lot of silica, asbestos, lead, arsenic, unburned portions of buildings, plastics, car batteries, antifreeze, pool chemicals. You're dealing with a lot of household waste materials that can endanger your health. And no wonder, we'll talk about how is it, another question that I had is Cal OSHA really going to enforce these health standards when most of these workers that we're discussing today in the cleanup phase, where they're not dealing with the hazmat portion of this cleanup, but is more a secondary cleanup of the surrounding areas, such as, cleaning furniture and surfaces that there's a lot of ash, dust, soot, etc. So how is Cal OSHA going to enforce this where the employers are homeowners, right? Is this something that is actually going to happen? So here is what I know for right now. I do know that Cal OSHA is out there, so they're making their presence known. And this is normal, you guys. If you think about other disasters that have occurred, 9/11, OSHA was there. They want to ensure that anyone involved in disaster and emergency response, that they stay safe. So they are doing inspections. With homeowners, I believe the focus for Cal OSHA right now is the guidance, the help. They need to know and understand what property owners and the workers and the people that they hired to do cleanup are being exposed to. So there's a lot of that by Cal OSHA right now. And so if you see Cal OSHA representatives, it is they will be pleased to help, that you're asking for guidance, etc. Nevertheless, I'm going to get into some changes that just took place, and by July 1st of this year, we're expecting that Cal OSHA will be full-blown enforcing some of these issues with even homeowners and who employ domestic workers to do certain jobs and activities that are hazardous by nature. So use dust control measures. So this second portion of this one-page guide opens your eyes to say, okay, so what we're trying to avoid is to get that dust airborne, right? So everything that you can get wet, so wet operations, wetting the areas until thoroughly soaked, wiping and misting with water, just plain water. And I invite you to also take a look at the 1 hour webinar in last month, also where Elizabeth was the UCLA UCI put together in regards to fire cleanup, a little bit more technical information, but they just, what I love about the information that was provided that day is that simple things such as soap and water, soapy water, warm water will do the job to clean the surfaces, to keep the surfaces clean, right? So continue to wet the work areas throughout the demolition process. If runoff can't be avoided, check with the local agency about storm drain protection. This is because we don't want these very toxic, hazardous waste materials to end up in our water sources. So there are actual storm drain protection devices that you can use to catch all that runoff, debris, slurry, etc., produced during this wet cleanup and operations. So the next thing on this one-page guide for workers is wearing personal protective equipment. So here is the thing. Once you're being hired to do cleanup, you need to have like a quick powwow meeting with the person that hire you or the company that hire you. And they should be conducting this tailgate meetings. But if not, you need to ask this question. Or what if it's a one-on-one type of thing where there's this homeowner who is hiring you because you've been doing their cleaning for the longest time, 30 years plus, I don't know, 20 years. And you're going to do it, but now you're in an area that was affected by the fire. You have a lot of ash, debris, soot, etc., and a lot of that dusty surfaces and stained surfaces in some parts of the property have maybe visible fire damage. So what are the things you need to do? You need to meet with this person who's hiring you, and you need to discuss actually what is in the air, what are the hazards. And you will not know this unless, and especially the closer you are to these fire affected areas, the more necessity for you to have a test or sampling of the surfaces that are to be cleaned up. So if you're going to be doing that cleanup and you're going to be wiping off surfaces and you're going to be exposing yourself, you need to know what type of personal protective equipment you need. And you cannot just randomly select it. You need to know what to wear. So, for example, safety glasses protect you against impact, but they have openings all around. If you're going to be spraying chemicals, you need to have goggles, protection that is more complete against splashes. You also need to take a look at the truth behind what kind of dust mask do you need. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about dust masks because the definition in the regulation is quite vague, and basically you have 9 types of dust masks with different types of protection. So you need to know what to wear. You need good work gloves, and depending on what you're going to be doing, the type of gloves. So you may need some chemical resistant gloves, nitrile, or just plain coated gloves, but sometimes those coated gloves will have the coating over here, so for you to actually work in your work environment, but the top is cloth, and that does not protect you against splashes with chemicals or anything that may be absorbed through the skin. So picking the right glove as well. Steel-toed work boots, right? So the a nice work boot. I don't want you out there with cloth tennis shoes, your regular Nikes, your regular sneakers, especially if you're going to be doing fire cleanup. Hard hats if over hazards or around construction equipment. That wouldn't be so necessary for domestic workers, for example, although I highly recommend that you take your hair up in a ponytail and a bun and you protect it, because your hair will also, there's a lot of particles that would settle in your hair. And so even a regular cap or hat will help. Earplugs, muffs. I don't want you to start getting creative and say, oh, maybe I put a shower cap, or, if I really need to be in, pants and long sleeves and all this, how about one of those chemical suits that you see in the hardware stores? Maybe one of those, they call them Tyvek suits. And this is the minimal protection. This is the guidance. And the reason why they don't get into all of that is because you may be needing more training and you may be overdoing it when it's not necessary. Tyvek suits are known for having some chemical resistance properties, but they will make the wearer overheat, right? And so there's a lot of things that you need to consider. Earplugs, earmuffs around loud noise. That is, if there's machinery or equipment that is very noisy. And when we talk about noise, if you're having to yell, when you're at arm's distance from another person, that's already hazardous noise levels. And OSHA measures that in dose during an 8-hour shift, what they call time weighted average, right? Keep the dust and the ash and all of those contaminants off your skin. So this is why it's important that you wear pants and long sleeve shirts, and that you have your face covered by goggles and a dust mask, which we'll talk about. And disposable coveralls are good. Just don't get creative with any chemical resistance suits. And remember that it's very important for you to shower once you get home. So the best thing you can do is dispose of the coverall before you even get into your car. For me, it's important that before you get into your car, if this is not a work vehicle, but that's your car, that you change your shoes, right? Because your shoes are going to be contaminated unless you put booties. But then I have issues with booties as well, because booties will make you slip in surfaces that are just regular flooring, vinyl flooring, tile flooring. They're very slippery. So you have to look into, weighing those options. So I can do the actual booties and then remove them, and you can get into your car with those same shoes, or just remove the shoes and have different shoes when you're doing this type of work or type of activities. Don't overheat. We talked about that. And remember that the danger of heat stress is still ongoing, especially when you're exerting yourself because you're doing activities such as cleanup. And drinking water, staying hydrated. Even during these spring months that are coming up, we do have some very hot days. And remember, this wildfire cleanup is going to stay with us for many, many weeks, right? So it's not something that we're going to do once. It's something that we're going to continue to do, especially because winds are going to pick up all that ash, and we're going to have some of these toxic materials and air contaminants continuously and constantly being deposited on our surfaces. So this is a job you're going to do often. Make sure you stay safe and healthy, drinking water, at least 1 quart of water per hour in hot weather. That's 2 gallons in an 8-hour shift. And many people say to me, I am not going to drink that much water. That is crazy. It's too much. I'm going to spend my whole day in the bathroom. But remember that with everything, even with heat, you get acclimatized. Also, the drinking of water, you can get your body used to this, and drinking water is super important. Also, for that processing internally of toxins and getting rid of toxins through, excretions such as sweat and also urine and feces. Don't take it home. Before you eat, drink, or smoke, wash your face and your hands thoroughly before getting in a vehicle. Knock dust off your clothes and clean shoes. And this is an interesting phrase of what they say: before getting in your vehicle, knock off the dust of your clothes and clean shoes while wearing your mask. So that's iffy, and as you can tell, this is an interesting portion of it, because they say, okay, don't take your mask off, but dust off because you've got contaminants on you. I would like to see a little bit more training and education also regarding the use of masks, because even taking them off appropriately will be super important, especially because if you're all dusty all over and you're knocking off dust before getting in your vehicle, you're getting all those contaminants on the outer surface of your mask. So taking it off without touching any of the surfaces of that mask is super important. And while I was reviewing these videos about how to put on and take off a dust mask, I realized that very few actually explain this or touch on the fact that you shouldn't be touching the mask to take it off. It has straps. You can leave it on your face and then just take the straps and carefully, with the straps, from the straps, just dispose of the mask. All right, by the way, that guide is in English and Spanish, and that's wonderful. There's a couple of news releases that I have put in my presentation just because this is an updates class, right? One of those is the actual increase in penalties. And so you can also see that that was released January 27th. And so we are looking at OSHA charging more for willful repeat violations, for general regulatory, so even not having posters that relate to the safety of the workers is going up. It used to be up to 7 grand, now it's up to 16 grand, etc. So these are things that you want to receive, sign up to that. And then there's also the culmination of that emergency standard for COVID-19. Nevertheless, you still have to protect workers and keep track of any cases you get at work. So the key points on the wildfire smoke regulation, as you know, where to monitor the air, to continue to monitor the air, to plan your work activities around this information for the AQI, which is the air quality index, and we're worried about that PM 2.5, which is the one that relates to smoke exposure. So once you get to checking air quality, and I explained this last month, air quality of 151 all the way to 500 says you must be wearing a dust mask, an N95, and it's a particulate respirator, right? And above 500, it should be mandatory, right? So now you don't say, hey, it's voluntary use. Now it's mandatory. And this is a very interesting thing in the regulation, because you would think that by the time that you hit that AQI PM 2.5 of 151 and above, you're already mandating the use of respirators. Nevertheless, it continues to be on a mandatory basis. So we're going on a voluntary basis. So we're going to talk about what that means. Now, aside from those key issues in the wildfire smoke regulation, we have the requirement that Kalosha is saying for employers to identify hazards. And this has been key all throughout since the birth of OSHA. Know the hazards you're exposing your workers to. What levels are they being exposed to, right? Because it's very different if you say, well, I had lead abatement in my house, and so you're going to be returning to a home that had fire damage, but they had already done a lot of the lead abatement, meaning they took off all that paint and they painted with all of these nice paints that did not contain lead. So now when this house burned down, or now that this house, you're doing cleanup, the lead amount, the amount of lead that you may encounter is so much less than in those other properties where, they were older buildings and most of the paint and the materials that this house was built with contain more of this toxic material. So knowing the hazards and identifying the hazards is key, so that once we know where we are facing, we can select appropriate PPE. That's why Kalosha also has a regulation, Title 8, Section 3380, that talks about you are going to make a determination as to the pieces of personal protective equipment needed for that task. And you're not just going to let your workers guess. You're actually going to make a determination by listing the hazards and taking a look at the task. How is it going to be done? And applying the hierarchy of controls, which means try to eliminate the hazard first and foremost, right? Why do they have to be there? Why do they have to deal with this instead of, hey, let's hire a specialized firm or a professional to get rid of all of the hazardous materials first, and then we will deal with what is left, which is the dust blown by the winds, etc. And for weeks, we will continue to do cleanup, and then knowing what this wind will bring to our surfaces in the work environment. So there's a couple of links here to the regulations that apply in this regard. So how does this affect domestic workers? Well, Kalosha is interpreting the application of fire cleanup to apply to domestic workers, not because it is domestic work, but because they say fire cleanup work, including ash and debris removal and cleaning of fire damaged structures, is not household domestic service. So even though you may be doing domestic work, if you're doing any of these activities, now you're covered by Kalosha standards, right? And so, like I said, Kalosha is already out there doing inspections. In regards to how they are enforcing it, I'm not too clear on that yet. I did make some phone calls to find out, and all I know is that they're there right now more than anything to provide guidance and help, right? Employees performing this work are covered for Kalosha health and safety standards. I did read an article where they talked about July of this year enforcing all of these issues with domestic workers and employers who blatantly disregard these types of requirements and health regulations. Some reminders here too. Remember that it is unlawful to enter or stay in an area where there's mandatory evacuation. That's number one. Number two, you have the right to refuse work in a disaster area if you believe it is unsafe to remain. So let's say you're called to work for your employer and he does not have clearance from the EPA that the property has been rendered safe to enter. well, then you have the right to refuse. And then there is that unlawful retaliation that could occur, that you could also put a complaint to OSHA about that issue, because uh, it is unlawful to take action against an employee who refuses work in a situation that is unsafe. So January 17, 2025, the website for the Domestic Worker Coalition put a news release in this regard. They also have a particular part of their website for their relief fund, and then they go ahead and talk about the exactly what I just explained, how CalOSHA is expanding health and safety protections for California's domestic workers now that we have so many areas impacted by fires. I did find some tools and resources by the Bureau of International Labor Affairs. So they have some tools and apps, and I invite you to take a look at this link. Let me see if I can actually put it in the chat, because there is a lot of different. I'll share the actual link here, but you can see migrant worker tools and resources, and then I'll put it in the chat. All right. And so aside from CalOSHA and OSHA have bilingual handouts and e-tools and guides, you have this site, and you also have, I looked up the Red Cross. So LA Recovery Efforts has a full page and some guidance, but also the Red Cross has a guide on how to do wildfire cleanup at your home because of how the fires have been affecting the LA area. So take a look at this on your own time. It's all in English. Nevertheless, some of the apps allow for many different languages, not just Spanish. And this was one of the questions, so I wanted to kind of direct you and give you an idea of where to find some of these resources. The next thing would be, let's see, if it's just that I looked at this picture when I was preparing for this webinar, and the comparison is just so stunning, and you just can't help but be in shock when you see these pictures, where you see homes and structures and entire neighborhoods just down to ashes, down to nothing but debris. And then right across from it, this beautiful residences that still stand. But because of the winds and because of all of the hazardous waste material on these sites, they're going to get a lot of this residue through their windows, through all of those openings that we usually have in our buildings and structures, where, with regular maintenance, we may find these issues, but now with this fire cleanup and aftermath, we are forced to really be diligent and look at how are we going to maintain good air quality inside our homes, and how often we need to start cleaning up surfaces, and what are we being exposed to. So I want you to start based off on that guide that I showed in the beginning. So that should be your basic garb and how you show up to do these cleanup activities, right? And then talk about that identification of hazards that we're required to do, because we know that, and one of the main ones, just so you know, for me is, do we have certainty that the water, so access to water, because doing hygiene, washing your hands and having drinking water is so important. LA has an actual link in their website where they tell you how to follow through with whether or not the area has good water to drink and use for hygiene purposes. I think I put the link here, but I will give it to you in a moment. So we have physical hazards, such as do we have structures? Am I walking into a home or a building where I still have the issue of fire byproducts? Because of what? Maybe there's a down power line that is still not fixed, and there's the issue of shock, exposure to electricity, flammable gases. Maybe the structure doesn't look very stable, and the walls and the foundation and all of that was affected. and maybe I have demolition next to me and sharp or flying objects because some of the windows, if maybe they were single pane, double pane, and some of them are broken. Sometimes you see a lot of the shattered windows just on one side and not the inside, which is better for the person, the homeowner. But nevertheless, taking a look and a walk around. Remember, we're big on walkthroughs and inspections. So this is something that you have to do as an employer, meaning if you're the homeowner, with your employee, meaning the domestic worker, whoever you're hiring to do this. Let me keep my house clean throughout these weeks where we still get ash, soot, etc. We have to also take a look at what are the health hazards. Maybe you still smell a lot of that awful smoke and soot and weird smells. And, it just depends on what burned, right? So if we have all those plastics and wood and resins, etc., it's a different smell than if you had organic matter, or there's actually protein that got burnt as well, right? So the smell is different. What are the health hazards? Is there carbon monoxide and liquids and silica dust and asbestos in some of this residue? The answer is yes, because think of we look at workers who do just maintenance in regular buildings, and whenever they do maintenance in regular buildings or demolition, they're looking at, do I have lead? Do I have asbestos, right? So now you have a combination of all of these materials that got burnt. And so now the actual residue is way more hazardous, right, than just the original product that was isolated or distinct. Now they're all mixed and melted together. And then the issue of confined hazard, right? Maybe you have attics, maybe you have spaces that are crawl spaces that we will have a higher concentration of these VOCs, volatile organic compounds, such as benzene and formaldehyde and toluene that affect your health. And you do not want to get into these spaces unless you've already done this recognition of where are the spaces, should we enter, should we not enter. That's what a confined space brings to the table, the issue of what are the hazards inside that space, right? And not getting into them unless you are properly trained. And remember, for even confined spaces, you have to do training, and there's professionals that can actually access these spaces, and they know how to do rescue in case someone gets overcome by any of these gases or the lack of oxygen in these spaces, which is most of the time what kills a lot of people, because we go into the spaces where the atmosphere has been depleted of oxygen because all these other gases have occupied the space, and many times they don't have an odor, and that is the reason why some companies add that extra smell to their gases so that you can detect leaks. But in this case, it's a fire. So you will have some of these spaces that are enclosed or confined spaces that you don't know what you don't know, right? So don't get into any of these crawl spaces, especially without knowing what you may be facing. Do not do it, especially because below 21% of oxygen in those areas is immediately dangerous to your life and health. People just go unconscious and die. That's what happens, right? So cleaning locations affected by smoke, but not directly damaged by fire. So that's most likely what many of the workers will be doing now that we are on this phase where we continue to have homeowners and people return to buildings and homes and their property and to occupy it. They want to have a livable space. And so we're getting calls to come and clean, right? So before starting work, make sure under fire officials and EPA, right? So we said phase one is the Army, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who are going to be rendering all these hazardous materials away, or they're going to take care of all those hazardous materials away from the property. And then it comes EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to say, okay, you A-okay. And what they're doing basically is taking a look at the actual amount of contaminants in the air or on surfaces still left after the cleanup took place. So when your hazmat crew or hazmat team left and they took all of the hazardous waste, EPA comes and they want to see how much is still left after the cleaning efforts, right? And so I think one of the questions had to do with that. What is the actual clearance for different contaminants such as asbestos and lead and arsenic? And doing some research, this is an interesting area of the fire cleanup because OSHA focuses more on air monitoring of these contaminants while you are doing work when these materials are not all melted together in now a more toxic compound, which is what the fire brings. It heats up the materials through the combustion. Depending on what is being burnt is the kind of residue you will get, right? A sticky mess or powdery ashy stuff, and it smells different and it needs to be cleaned differently. So we have to take a look at what our local health department is saying, although I do have some responses for you at the end, and I'll put them there. So once the officials have declared the area safe, depending on the proximity to the fire, the resident may have a professional test their home. And now we get into, to have good air, good clean air, homeowners need to look into HEPA filters and also some of those carbon filters, because you want to make sure that those gases and VOCs are also being trapped through those through your mechanical ventilation. So verifying working electricity and safe water supply. Oh, and here's where I put where to check for water supply in your area. Let me see. Let me see if I can share with you guys. So, yeah, okay, so here, as you can see, there's water alerts. Impacts to county services and facilities. So there's everything about human shelters, animal shelters, a lot of great stuff, health alerts, but there's also the water alerts. So it kind of tells you, depending on the areas, what is the water alert for your local water district provider. So let me put it right here. I'll take a look at, yes, you will get a copy of the presentation. Okay, very nice. Let me go back to my PowerPoint here. So you have a lot of also public resources, and we have here the AIHA is also, well, it's the Association for Scientists, Professionals to Preserve Our Mental Health. And they have a nice video with also Michelle Rosales explains a lot of preparing for fires. And I like that portion of the equation because what she was talking about during the webinar in January 30th is that the fires are not going to be gone forever. That although we are having to go through all the pains of fire cleanup and the aftermath of staying constantly aware of the hazards we're being exposed to and the winds and what's settling down on our surfaces, we're also having to think of preparedness, and that is a huge portion of the equation. And stay tuned because the UCLA UCI Southern Education Research Center will have more webinars in that regard. Okay. And then everybody's looking at my PowerPoint, right? So returning to homes, like we said, LA County has put out a lot of information about that phase 1 cleanup, which is done by the hazmat professionals at no cost to the residents. And then we have the phase 2 cleanup, which is where you're given 2 choice, right? Once the EPA has cleared you and giving you the A-OK to move to phase 2, you can have the Army Corps of Engineer or do an out-of-pocket professional to go through your property so that you can do debris removal. And just keeping in mind that in that phase 2, what you're facing is hazardous household waste, right? Now remember, these are all those highly toxic chemicals in the form of pool chemicals, car batteries, and you're thinking, what does that expose me to? So now you have a mixture of, or compounded toxic mixtures of car battery, which has the issue of sulfuric acid, which is corrosive, etc. Antifreeze mixed with oils and solvents and fertilizers and, propane residue and disinfectants and aerosols and paints and bleach. So all of this is dangerous to your health. Therefore, now we move on to how am I going to protect myself? The N95 is the respirator to choose at a minimum, right? And I already talked about the rest of what you need to be wearing. But now you need to look at, okay, so once I pick the type of PPE I'm going to wear and hold off on the mask, we're going to go into different types of masks, etc. Look at some of the already established procedures out there and guidelines on how to do cleanup. So the Red Cross has a nice guide that starts by saying to remove soot and smoke from walls, furnitures, floors, use a mild soap or detergent, mix it together, 4 to 6 tablespoons of trisodium phosphate and 1 cup household cleaner. Now, mind you, TSP, trisodium phosphate, is a corrosive. So you need to take a look at, you need appropriate PPE. How do you know what kind of PPE? Well, you have to take a look at the chemical safety data sheet. This is why it's so important to educate and to really talk about those workers who in the past have not had this type of training. If you're going to clean up, and here are the actual cleaners and chemicals we're going to use, we need to look at the safety data sheet, right? So that section 7 and 8 will actually tell you what are the precautions and the personal protective equipment recommended. They'll tell you the type of glove. They'll tell you the type of eye protection. They'll tell you whether or not you need to wear coveralls, etc. So you do not need to complicate your life. Once you've chosen the method to clean a certain surface and what chemical you're going to use, after reading the label, make sure you read the safety data sheet. Now, in regards to the dust mask or the respiratory protection you're going to use, remember the following. The safety data sheet will tell you what you need, and sometimes it'll call for something not as basic as an N95. It'll ask for an elastomeric piece with specific type of cartridge, for example, for the exposure to chlorine gas. If you're going to be cleaning with bleach solutions, it'll ask for an actual elastomeric piece with an appropriate set of cartridges. So that goes beyond this very basic dust mask. So let's talk about those filtering face pieces. And many people say that's not a respirator, it's just a paper mask. Well, and I'll show you pictures of what a real paper mask is versus an NIOSH certified respirator. So paper masks with the double straps and the NIOSH seal on them are respirators. They're filtering, air purifying face masks, and they're respirators. So a filtering face piece means a negative pressure particulate respirator. It means negative because your lungs are doing the work. You're breathing in, and that acts as the motor pulling in the air to filtrate the air you're breathing, because the air outside as you're cleaning is dirty. It's got these contaminants, right? And so it needs to have a nice seal, right? And it's the actual paper, the material the paper is made of, it's a filter for those contaminants, right? And the filtering medium has its limitations. It's not like it's going to filter all kinds of contaminants. So the size of the particle matters. So for those of you that are thinking, okay, so I don't even know what asbestos is, for example. Asbestos is found in the, natural crust of the earth. So there's some areas in our country that has more asbestos in the air than others, per se. Asbestos is also mined, taken out of mines to actually build materials for construction purposes, because asbestos is a fiber or a material that is resistant to fire, right? So there's different types of asbestos, but these fibers are so tiny and so small that an N95, and then I'll explain why an N95 will not work with it, and that's because the fiber will actually travel through the holes of that filtering piece. So now that we talked about that, we need to talk about the different types of paper masks or filtering pieces. And I don't like calling them paper masks because a lot of people say, well, a paper mask is not a respirator. And you're right, but I'll show you the picture of what a true paper mask is all about. So 9 different types. You have 9 different combinations because you can have these different types depending on the level of oil resistance and the filter efficiency. The filter efficiency talks about how much of this particulate matter will travel through and make it to your nose and respiratory tract, right? So if you have a 95 number, that means it's 95% efficient, right? You have a 99, that means 99% efficient. And when you have a 100, it's not really 100, meaning it's not going to really filter out all those particles, hazardous particles, when you are actually breathing in, but it'll, still let 3 of those 100 particles, 3 of those will make it through. So that's a 99.97% efficient. Okay, so now when you combine the levels of oil resistance, because remember, a lot of these things that burn down are a mixture that will represent also exposure to some oils, right? So you want to take a look at what your mask says. N95, all of the N's means not oil resistant, so it is a particulate filter, but it's not resistant to oil. R, 95, 99, and 100, somewhat resistant to oil. And the P95, P99, and P100s are resistant to oil or oil proof. So what are the issues with these different types? Okay, so this is a table put out by Home Depot. And I liked it just because it's simple enough and it gives workers a chance to take a look at, cloth face mask and single-use face mask, are not respirators. This is not what we're talking about. But when we have an N95 standard disposable respirator, it needs to have the seal that says NIOSH and it tells you N95 on it. Now, some of you were asking about those K95s. Anything that it is a K will not, it's more like a K95 was not made here in the United States. Most likely is some of that stock that you had during COVID-19 made in China, not NIOSH or laboratory tested. So you don't really know that it is doing all the filtration up to 95% efficiency. That's what it is. Mind you, even with this dust mask that say N95, you don't really have that 95% efficiency because it highly depends on the fit. Meaning, if you're putting it on well enough so that it seals against your face, against your skin. And mind you, a ton of workers are wearing this mask when they have facial hair, beards, mustaches, or a 5 o'clock shadow, just a little bit of stubble, and then that will push the mask off and you will not get a good seal. And then you have those N95 surgical ones because they have the material is also coated against splashes or fluid resistance. Now, when I talk about respirators, there's different models, and you can see this one has the NIOSH seal on it with the N95, and it looks different from this one. And some people will say, well, that one is a paper mask and the other one is not. This is where this myths and all this misinformation stops. They're both N95s. The only difference is the model is different, and it's made different so that it fits different people. Our faces are different, so different models will fit you differently. You have to find the one that helps give you a good seal. That's the reason behind it. The second thing is they both have 2 straps. For these masks to be considered respirators, they have to have 2 straps. You see the yellow straps and the blue straps on the other one? Okay. Now, we have these other examples where you see the one with the pink filters. Okay, that one is a NIOSH P100. Now you know what that means. Oil resistant and 99.97% efficiency, right? So that means for every 100 particles of contaminant, maybe 3 will get through, right? But it's resistant to oil, and this is the one that we are recommending when doing fire cleanup, where you are facing ash, soot, etc. So this is the better protection. Now, let's stop right there and clarify. Anything that looks like this one with the pink filters is not a dust mask, is not a paper mask. This is an elastomeric piece. And because of that rubber seal, it's a more sophisticated piece of equipment that requires medical clearance. What does that mean? It requires that you fill out a questionnaire and send it to your doctor to see whether or not he says you're A-okay to wear a respirator. Now, the respirator next to it has the seal of N100. So it's not resistant to oil, but it has that efficiency of 99.97%. So what's the difference between that one and the first one with the yellow straps? There's a huge difference. The particulate, actually the filtering medium, or what the mask is made of, has smaller openings, so it'll be way harder for you to breathe. And it also makes it where when you exert yourself and you sweat, you have that possibility of the material getting soaked with sweat more easily. And then you can't breathe because now the little tiny openings for you to breathe through are soaked with sweat. A lot of considerations. Now, this is a true paper mask. So right on your screen, you have something that is available at any hardware store or even 99-cent store. And this is a true paper mask. This is not a respirator. It has just the actual one strap, which will not give you a good seal no matter what you do. No matter what you do, you will not get a good seal. And you're thinking, so why do these masks, why are they available? Because they're for nuisance dust. This has nothing to do with fire cleanup. It has nothing to do with anything occupationally done. I mean, some employers will allow these paper masks, but nevertheless, is not something that should be required or in your program. Oh, I hope that cleared up the differences. And I wanted to add this one because I didn't talk about the R95s. So this is an example of an R95. There's your double strap. There's the actual metal piece that allows for you to get a better fit. And then there is the R95 symbol on it. But this one is also odor resistant because it has a layer of carbon in the filtering medium, which will allow to filtrate some of those VOCs. Nevertheless, and I like this mask because it's resistant to oil. But like I said, all of these that we've been talking about, except for the one that I showed you here, the one with the pink filters, all of those can be worn on a voluntary basis without a respiratory program in place. Once you start getting into half or full face respirators with the rubber seal, you have to have a program that includes the medical evaluations, etc. Now, and that's regulatory requirements. Now, am I saying here, if you're wearing a P100, an N100 in the form of a paper mask, or what we're saying, dust masks, you don't ever have to get clearance from your doctor? No, by all means, tell your doctor, I'm going to be wearing an N100 or a P100 respirator on a voluntary basis. And my employer or whoever is hiring me is not sending me to the doctor or telling me that I need to be evaluated, but he did or she did tell me that I needed to talk to you about it, especially because I've had asthma in the past, etc. So he or she may not be in agreement with you wearing these types of masks. Okay, there's many types of respiratory protection. The one that we said are filtering face piece respirators, 9 different types considered respirators by OSHA are the ones in the circle in red, right? The rest, for all of these shown on your screen, you need a respiratory protection program in place, which includes the actual medical clearance and evaluation. By the way, I did see that question about if hazmat workers need to have a different questionnaire to be cleared to use respirators. And it's the same. It's Appendix C of the regulation. All workers who are to don or put on a mask, a respirator on a mandatory basis, need to fill out that same questionnaire. OSHA has an e-tool that it is fantastic where they explain the difference between these respirators. If you're working more formally for a company that hires you to do janitorial services after the fire, you will most likely be wearing a combination respirator where you will have both the particulate filter plus the gas and vapor filters. Because remember, a particulate filter like the ones that we saw, the dust mask, only filter particulates, right? So the hazards that you're faced, such as what? Asbestos. Asbestos is a fiber, it's a particulate. Lead as well. But when you talk about chlorine gas, the dust mask will not protect you against it, right? And so you need to take a look at what combination of cartridges and filters will help you actually get good air through that mask. So I did get a question about the difference between the N95 and the P100. So the P100s in the form of a dust mask are more rare to find. Nevertheless, they are available. And the best thing to do when we talk about P100s is to really get your doctor to say that you're okay to use it. So watch out for that. Cal OSHA is saying that people involved in, cleaning, whenever you have all those surfaces with settled dust, etc., are okay to wear a minimum of an N95 on a voluntary basis. It's less costly, but it's not oil resistant. And remember, you cannot use it if you have facial hair. Here are some examples of how these masks are used usually when we're not talking about wildfires, right? But it does give you an idea as to, take a look at this. The N95s are used for when healthcare workers were exposed to COVID, right? But they could not wear that same mask if they were in a manufacturing environment where the powders of these chemicals for pharmaceuticals were in the air. They needed an N99, etc. An R95 for auto repair and paint spraying, because now you're talking about oils in the air or the misting that they're exposed to. Air R100 manufacturing with oil mists. So it gives you an idea of how this different selection of respirators is done. Now, do I need a medical evaluation? The answer is no. If the employer is saying we're going to wear an N95 or any of those 9 different types of dust mask, you do not need a medical evaluation. Is it recommended? Heck yeah. It's the best way to help workers stay safe and healthy. And if your employer doesn't have a program and they're going to be doing it on a voluntary basis, I highly recommend that workers ask their doctor about it. Now, there is an actual video on how to put on and take off these respirators on the website for Cal OSHA. And this is still out there, but it was meant more during the COVID pandemic, where the actual respirator could be reused. All of those dust masks, the 9 types of N95, R95, P100s, all of those 9 that I talked about in the form of a dust mask, are disposable. And if you have enough of them, there is no reason why you should be storing them. The video will show that you put them on by stretching the straps first. And let me see if I can play it. And if not, we'll leave it at the very end. But disregard the part of the storage. Hold on a
Alba, I
second.
did want to let you know that we are at noon. So if we wanted to continue, or we'll still be recording the session. So for anyone that can't stay any longer, we'll also be posting the recording as well. But I do also just want to keep in mind that we are at 12, and to just make that announcement
So
here.
I'll just go through the questions. I'm about to finish with the slides. I talked about the e-tool, and then the only thing that is left is a little bit about those thresholds, and this is my objective slide. So basically done with the content of the webinar. Thank you, Liz, for talking to me about that. So I just wanted to really highlight the issue of, you're going to find a lot of different videos out there on how to put on a dust mask and how to take it off. Remember that all those contaminants on your mask also have a potential for skin absorption. You do not want to touch that mask when you take it off. So a lot of those videos, what I notice is they guide you to take the mask off by grabbing it and pulling the straps down. Do not do that. Just when you're done wearing your respirator, you're done for the day, take them by the straps, and without shaking it, put it in the trash, right? There's an e-tool by Cal OSHA for respiratory selection. So I love that they have that for us. And key step for assessing some key thresholds. Oh, yes. So because we know we have so many contaminants that represent the issue of needing respirators while on site, just remember that every single contaminant has a permissible exposure limit. So the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot select a respirator unless you know the amount of the contaminant you're being exposed to. And you will only know that if there is testing done on the property that you're going to be cleaning. Now, if this is a homeowner, unless they have the money to do this, because remember, they should be paying, they have two options, right? They're going to be cleared by the EPA, and then they can also get a pay out of pocket if they want to go through debris, etc. But for you to be present at a site where you'll be doing cleanup constantly, an N95 is minimum. And then depending on what the contaminants at the site are all about, then you go from that to the next level, which would be those P100s and R100s, or even the N100s. And now you know what the letter means. And now you know what the number means. So if hazardous materials are suspected, such as asbestos, silica, and any other ash and debris cleanup, remember that minimum N95, best P100. But when you are using a P100, I highly advise that you get medical clearance because it's hard to breathe through those. And also remember that if it's on a voluntary basis, your employer is not required to provide that medical evaluation or have an actual respiratory protection program in place. All right. So assigned protection factor, respirators, depending on the type of respirator they are, have an assigned protection factor. For example, for those masks, the APF is 10, which means that when you're inhaling, no more than 1/10 of the airborne hazardous contaminant will leak into the mask or what you're breathing. So all of those things are important. And then that's it. I wanted to make sure we talked about some of these protections and differentiate some of these N95s and P100s, understand the distinction between mandatory and voluntary. And now you know what this is all about. And then some of those thresholds, which really you'll get to the nitty-gritty of it when you have sampling done at those buildings and areas that are being cleaned up, recovered, etc. So what type of outreach is most effective to help immigrant workers? And this is the question portion of the webinar. For those of you that need to go and your tummies are rumbling, thank you so very much for your time. I'm just going to stay to make sure your questions are answered. I gave you some apps, and the Department of Labor has some information, but the truth is many times we have people that are not very computer savvy, or they don't have the time because they're doing, work and labor all day long. The last thing they want to do is go home and look up tools. So my greatest suggestion is, as we do outreach, such as these webinars, etc., printing out materials in Spanish or the actual languages that the people in your community speak should be the way to go. So that one-page guide that Kalosha issued, that is huge. That is a really good one, and they have it in Spanish right now. So I'm pretty sure they will have more information in other languages and through the CDC, the actual local health department, etc. So look up those things. OSHA is great. I mean, the e-tools like the one I showed you to select respirators, etc., really, really great. But just outreach through these webinars, through one-page handouts, super important. Number two, the different on the screening questionnaire. I talked about this. The screening questionnaire for hazmat.
Almost.
Yeah.
Sorry, before you go too much into the other question, I just wanted to really quickly mention that there's so many wonderful worker centers and advocacy groups and community organizations that are already doing outreach to immigrant workers. For example, there's Hand in Hand, there's the California Coalition for Domestic Workers. I'm sorry if I'm butchering any of the names, I'm just trying to go a little fast here. There's SoCal Kosh, there's the National Kosh. SoCal Kosh is the most like local Kosh group. There's a lot of other organizations that you can also reach out to that are also already creating a lot of these materials for their members and for these workers. So really want to encourage you all to connect with them and see if you can get these materials and also how you may be of assistance to these different organizations as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yes, you're involved. You're heavily involved with a lot of this outreach. So I think you would be the best
Yeah.
person to ask this question to. So yeah, I love it. Um, so the same questionnaire, okay? And I have two more questions then that I will get to. Give me a second. Same questionnaire for anyone, right? Because it's your doctor who is going to look at these questions, how you answered, and then if anything raises a red flag, they'll bring you into the office to do an actual physical evaluation and take a look at your lung capacity, etc. 3 assessments in respiratory protection. So this is basically what I went more in detail about differences between what a filtering dust mask is. It's a respirator. And I showed you an actual picture of the only type of mask that is not considered a respirator. And that's what we call a paper mask with one strap. A paper mask with one strap, I don't care about. It's not going to help you anywhere unless you are outside sweeping your patio. That's the only, and I'm not talking even, and please, when I'm saying that, I have to correct myself, not for fire affected areas, because even sweeping your patio would bring the issue of exposure. So you don't want to do that with a paper mask, right? What tools are being used to assess the respiratory hazards? Okay, so there's a lot of tools that industrial hygienists are using. That's why you call a professional to make the assessments. Homeowners need to disclose the year their home was built, or all the records are available so that industrial hygienists and professionals come and actually take a look at, what do they need to assess for. So they're going to use gas meters, they're going to assess for particulate matter, and they will start sampling, either personal sampling or area sampling. So you can take a look more into Googling for what are adequate gas meters, or what measures particulate matter related to asbestos and lead and etc. But like I said, that depends on a professional, and that's what industrial hygienists do. And those are the tools that they will use to assess the respiratory hazards present at that particular area. What is cleanup? Clearance criteria for settled asbestos, lead, arsenic on surfaces. This arsenic has to be non-detect. I am unfortunately not going to give you a very good answer in this, because we were talking about we're learning as we go, right? So there are some criteria for settled asbestos, and I think one of the things that I researched about that is once the cleaning efforts are done, you're going to sample for how much of these things you still have on surfaces. And so for asbestos, they're talking about no more than 70 fibers that you can count in 1 cubic millimeter of space. So that's for asbestos. It's different for lead. I don't remember the exact number. And for arsenic, what I found out is that neither OSHA or the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists have any information on this. They do have the permissible exposure limits, the threshold limit values, etc., but they do not come up with a number on arsenic because it depends on a variety of issues. So the response to this one should be, take a look at what your local health department is recommending. Because this last question is more technical, and it has to do with once the cleanup efforts have taken place, hazardous waste has been removed, how much of these things we still have settling on our surfaces, and what's considered safe, right? So there's an idea there for asbestos. I think for lead, let me see if I can quickly take a look at what I had researched in that regard. But lead. And you know what? I can actually maybe send an email about this later, because I don't want to answer something that I'm not very familiar with. Remember that surface contamination clearance criteria is not just regulated by OSHA, but also by EPA. And that's just completely out of my scope. And you also have the local health departments right now, because of the fires, putting information out there for those making decisions about contamination clearance, surface contamination clearance criteria. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Alba. I just wanted to mention that for that question, I also reached out to a colleague that works for DTSC. So once I get more information, I will connect with Veronica so that the resources that I'm given will also be shared to all participants via email. So everything that we're mentioning, we're also going to be sharing in email format, so that you all have access, direct access to the resources as well.
Right. And I know now why with lead, I didn't want to give you any numbers. And it's because it also depends on the type of surface. Is it flooring? Is it windowsills? Is it window troughs, etc.? So a lot of those questions will be answered as you go along, unfortunately. And thank you, Liz, for getting those resources gathered for our participants. I have two more questions here. One says, under the voluntary use of respirator, the Cal OSHA standard says you still need to evaluate that the respirator itself is not a hazard. What types of hazards would Cal OSHA look for? So it's exactly what I was talking to you guys about. What if that employee has had asthma episodes in the past, or certain things trigger respiratory difficulty? Then you will never know, because you're not doing a medical evaluation when you're saying, hey, you can wear this respirator on a voluntary basis. Those are the hazards Cal OSHA is looking for. And let me tell you, historically, Cal OSHA and employers have had this battle with this voluntary basis, because wearing a NIOSH certified dust mask with the N95 or R or P, and then the efficiency number on it, makes it to where the individual is having this issue of putting something that seals against the face, and their lungs are acting as a mechanism to draw air, clean air. And so, and when I say clean air, remember, it depends on the assigned protection factor and the actual efficiency of the filtering medium. So those are the hazards Cal OSHA is talking about. So to stay on the safer side, I would advise that even on a voluntary basis, you send them to be cleared by your industrial doctor. Is that feasible for you? I don't know. It depends on your safety budget, right? So that's where we get into making decisions for our workforce. So if you want to make sure this happens the right way, even if it's a voluntary basis, you say, you know what, I'm going to be telling them that the best way to go about doing cleanup is N95s on a voluntary basis, but I want to be on the safe side. Let's just go and implement the respiratory protection program, send them to be evaluated by a doctor, and have them fit tested, and teach them full blown how to take it on, how to put it on, take it off, and how to check for seals. And so that's my recommendation. That's what Cal OSHA would like to see, but it's not always feasible because of budget, right? I hope that answered that question. When cleaning furniture with soap and water is the next question now. Can you dump the rags in regular trash and container? And can I wash the rags and reuse them? Okay, so I think up until now, the guidance says that anything containing ash can be thrown in the regular container as long as it is enclosed in a plastic bag. So make sure you put it all in a plastic bag. I don't know about using the rags to reuse, washing the rags and reusing them. So the Red Cross guidance to clean up does say that you can wash things, and then it gives you guidance as to how much bleach, and that you can put it with hot soapy water, just regular cycle. But I mean, how costly is it to just get a ton of rags for your workers? It shouldn't be that costly, especially when you're doing fire cleanup, right? And then you look into the waste issue of it all. So it's a good question, Jose. I would like to actually take a look at what the recommendations from your local health department or health agency are all about. Sometimes a call, sometimes an email. The California Department of Public Health is really good at answering emails. So maybe putting that one out there. For right now, I don't know if you've heard anything different about this, but LA County is allowing anything with ash residue to be put in regular trash, just enclosed in a plastic bag.
Yes, that's what I've been hearing as well. I would say something also to keep in mind is keep in mind what it is that you're cleaning and how much is on the surface as well. So I would also keep that in mind when you're making any sort of decisions about reuse, because we do know that, that is a factor that plays in to whether you have the capacity to get more resources, or if you're doing this job and this is all you're given, what can you do with the resources that you have? And they're very difficult, questions to answer because it really is on a case by case basis.
Yes, thank you, Liz. And then I have here someone pitching in some information about the latest contaminant level for lead, Title 17, California Department of Public Health. And I want to add to that Cal OSHA passed the new permissible exposure limit for lead in February 2024, and it's enforceable starting now, January 2025. That just made everything more difficult about wildfire cleanup. Because in the aftermath, when you have all of these debris, ash, soot, and materials combined together, where you have all of those things that we talked about, arsenic and lead and asbestos and all of that, because the level of the permissible exposure limit on lead changed so drastically, now we are taking a look at how fast, how quickly workers are being overexposed. So that's where I tell you guys, a simple N95 will not do the job. And so this is where your industrial hygienist help you to give you these numbers so that you can make a decision for better protection. And that's when you start making decision as to an N95 is not sufficient. Like we know, even prior to wildfire cleanup, we know that for asbestos, we cannot ask our workers to wear an N95, right? This is why it's going in phases. This is why it's so important that we start with phase one, where all the hazmat crews are doing all the heavy duty work, and then we're moving on to phase two, and then we have homeowners saying, okay, now my house, I got permission to move on to phase two and I can return to my house, etc. So now you're not facing all of these issues of the heavy duty contaminants in the air beyond the permissible exposure limit. But still, because we have winds, etc., maybe your home or the home you're cleaning is right next door to one of those fields where everything is ash and debris. So how much of that are you getting into the home, right? And then I know Michelle Rosales spoke extensively last week or January 30th regarding installing HEPA filters with carbon filters in your home to not only get rid of those air contaminants, but also the VOCs in the home environment. So that is important because then you will be cleaning inside a building or structure where the contaminants have been reduced under the permissible exposure level. So don't forget, and I don't have an answer for the lead issue because the actual permissible exposure limit and action levels changed so much. It used to be 50 micrograms per cubic air meter, so now it's down to 10. And the action level used to be 30, and now it's down to 2. So it's so drastic that now with this wildfire cleanup, they're looking into what is the actual protection that we need to have out there. So.
Well, thank you, Alba. I will go ahead and wrap up our webinar here. Thank you all who have stayed. I know we're over time and we're hoping that we answered your questions. And if you have any additional questions that we don't have time to get to at this moment, please feel free to email us at erc@ph.ucla.edu. And we're more than happy to provide any additional resources. If you have any specific questions that you want more assistance with, that's where we're here. And then just really quickly, if you do want any continuing education hours for attending, please complete the evaluation. The evaluation link is shared in the, but we will also be sending a link to the evaluation through email as well. So with that, thank you everyone. who had stayed around, and we hope to see you next month.
Absolutely. And
Bye.
stay tuned about the change in date, please.
Yeah.
Thank you, Liz. See you soon.